Hey everybody, it is Professor Parish, and welcome back to English 122. We are in week 6. Insane, right? We're a third of the way through the class. Crazy talk. I'm recording this Sunday night, so your paper number 1 is due tonight over prose. Please make sure that you turn that in because you will only get a chance to revise if you turn in the paper, and it's worth a lot of points. So make sure that you get that turned in tonight. I'm going to talk about how to revise the paper very quickly, very soon rather, and we're going to start talking about poetry. And I'm going to give you guys kind of a heads up about this next section because now that we're in week 6, things are going to go a little bit quicker with poetry and drama. Not too fast, but we are going to spend less time on poetry and drama than we did with prose because prose is such a huge unit and it's so foundational to what we are going to write about. But we don't spend as much time with poetry and drama only because I want to give you extra time to work on your final project. So you're going to probably think that the poetry and drama sections are going to move quicker, and that's very much the case because what you're going to find out is that there's a lot of terminology with poetry, a lot. And we're going to spend a couple weeks on that for sure. But drama does not have nearly as much terminology, and a lot of what we've built and used as the foundation for terminology in prose is going to come back and repeat itself for poetry and drama. So with that in mind, I want to show you all what's due for this week. Scrolling down to week 6, there are really only 2 assignments. One is the week 6 discussion forum, which I'll show you all very soon. Posts due Friday, responses due Sunday. And the other is the thesis statement for paper 2. Like, what are you going to write about? What is your topic? You don't have to do an outline yet. Outline's going to be next week. But the same thing. I just want to know what is your option that you picked for paper 2? What choices are you making? What are you comparing and contrasting if you choose option 1? And we're going to go over the guidelines. Why did you choose these? And then what questions you have about paper 2 so far. So with that being said, let's talk about the guidelines for paper 2. So I actually revised these. So I think one person has submitted their thesis already. So when you watch this video, you may be like, that doesn't look like the guidelines I read. I revised it because I realized the dates are wrong. So I accidentally uploaded the wrong paper 2 guidelines. I uploaded them from a previous semester. So I am human. That does happen to teachers just like students. So I went back and re-uploaded the right file. So if you've looked at these guidelines already, go back and re-download them because now they've been updated. So with poetry, we are going to do a little bit of creative writing. Not a lot, so don't panic, but a little bit. So our second paper delves into the topic of poetry. Poetry combines pattern, persona, theme, tone, form, words, image, metaphor, and symbolism, among many other terms, to create a piece of text that has rhythm and an extended message. So often readers are left with clear emotions, but a lot of poetry can be left up to interpretation, which is why I think a lot of people struggle with it or get frustrated, because authors don't have to be clear on the meaning. Poetry can be very vague, depending on what the author is wanting to do. So you have 2 options. 2. One option is more traditional. You can either choose 2 poems or 2 songs, because songs, as we will find out, are lyrics, which is a type of poetry, from your textbook or from an alternate source. So this can be a poetry book, can be a website, can be any other alternate source, or it can come from our textbook. As you can see, there's lots of material in this textbook to draw from. So if you don't want to find an outside source, you can pick 2 poems from this. But the idea is that you are going to compare and contrast the 2 songs or 2 poems that you picked and tell me how they're similar and different, which one you like better, why. And then at the very end, you are going to construct either your own short verse of poetry or your own song verse that mirrors one or both of those that you talked about in your paper. So there's a tiny little bit of creative element to this paper just so that I can see that you understand the terminology and you understand what you've been comparing and contrasting, and you can kind of imitate it. Now, This is not a creative writing class. So am I expecting y'all to be Edgar Allan Poe? No. Am I expecting y'all to be Shakespeare? No. I just want to see that you can show effort and that you know what you're talking about. That's pretty much it. So as long as you attempt something, you'll be fine. Option 2 is the more creative option. Option 2 is where you can take 2 pictures that you have, and you are going to create 2 poems based off each of those pictures, and then compare and contrast them. Except instead of breaking down the author's intent, you're kind of breaking down your own choices. You're telling me, why did you pick these pictures? What terminology did you find when you were creating the poems? What did you choose? Why did you choose to write the poems the way that you did? It's all based on the terms from our chapter, combined with your own opinions and reasoning. So those are your 2 options. And I've had students pick both and do wonderful. So it's totally up to you what you want to do. This paper will seem a little bit shorter than the last paper. Your analysis, where you compare and contrast, has to be 2 full pages. And then if you chose option 2, each of your poems has to be half a page each. If you chose option 1, then I want a full page, several verses of poetry. So it's going to be 3 pages altogether, except 2 pages is going to be analysis. All right. 12-point fonts on the analysis, no bold or large text. With the poems themselves, you can go crazy. The actual poems, you can do any font, any size, any text, any style, but the analysis should be 12-point double-spaced font. Margins should stay the same. The poems you create should be on their own page. Grammar and spelling. If you choose option 1, obviously I want you to cite your textbook, and then if you get any outside sources for poetry, cite those. If you choose option 2, you do still have to cite your textbook because you're talking about poem terminology, but if you're using your own photos, you don't have to cite your own work. If you get 2 pictures off of Google Images or something like that, you do need to cite Google Images where you got those photos. And next week, we're going to talk in the next couple of weeks about MLA and do a refresher on that. And then obviously all components are due on time. So here's where I've updated for your assignment. This coming Sunday, the 27th, right? 27th? Yes. I was like, is it 27th or 28th? The 27th Sunday is when your thesis is due. Outline is due next Sunday, the 4th. Then there will be a week in between. So you're actually going to get Columbus Day weekend. You're going to get that to write the paper. And then that following week, the 18th, is when your actual paper is going to be due. So you almost get 4 weeks to write this paper. So it seems like this section will go by faster. We're about a week shorter than we were with prose, but you are still getting, I feel, ample time to write this paper. And you will get a chance to revise it. So I will be honest, most students in the class say this is the weirdest paper of the class because it's so different. But I feel like with our prose paper, it's very cut and dry. It all feels familiar. You're either writing about stuff you know or you're creating your own story. This paper is going to get us out of our comfort zone a little bit. It's going to get us out of our comfort zone a little bit with writing and analyzing lit. And then I think, though, that that's going to help shape ourselves when we come back and do the drama paper and the final project. So that's my hope anyway. But that's how this paper 2 is set up. Like I said, the guidelines have been updated online, so you should be able to see those. As far as how to revise a paper, when you get paper 1 back, which I will be reviewing those this week and giving them back to you, and I'll go ahead and go to the discussion forum while I'm pulling this up. When you get your paper back, you will need to open it up through Microsoft Word. So papers will be revised this week and turned back in. So, or here, this is what I'm going to change. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to review. I'm going to go track changes. Let's say I meant to say graded this week and turned back to you to revise. Okay. So you're going to get your paper back, and it's probably going to look something like this. You're going to open your paper up in Word, paper 1, and you're going to see that there's a red line out to the side. Now you have to open it up in Word in order to see this. If you open it up in a different file format, it's probably not going to show you this line. Unfortunately, if you turned your paper in through PDF, I can't edit PDFs, so I can just tell you what to revise, but you won't have access like this. This is only if you turned in a Word document or a rich text format file. You're going to see this red line. Click it. When you click the font line, you're going to see this red text pop up. This is where I have edited out a word and replaced it with something different. To incorporate these changes into your revisions, it's really, really simple. All you do is you go over the red text, you right click on it, and you're going to see two options. You can either reject or accept the change. Obviously you want to accept it. So when I accept it, you'll notice it's taken away the word that I crossed out. And now I have to go back and I can accept the insertion of this word. Now notice this gray line is still here. Watch what happens when I take this last edit off. Two things have happened. One, there's no more red text. And two, that line has disappeared. If you see 0 lines on the side of your paper, that means you've accepted or deleted all of the changes and you're ready to submit those revisions. If you still see a line, that means that somewhere in that sentence there is an edit to make. And with punctuation, it can be hard, because watch what happens if I put a comma in here. It's really hard to see that comma, right? And it's even harder to right click on it, but you can. Sometimes I have to highlight it and then do it. Yeah, see, it's being annoying. But eventually, it's going to let me get to it. And I'm going to be able to accept it. So, that is the change. And it's still letting me make changes now. So that's how you revise. With papers 1, 2, and 3, as long as you submitted an initial draft, you will get the option to revise that draft. If you don't submit a draft, you don't get the option. It's kind of an all or nothing thing. You either do the work and submit it and get a chance to go back and fix things, or if you don't submit the work, you don't get that opportunity. So just make sure there will be due dates on revisions, and you'll be able to see them in your course assignments. But I am going to get you your paper 1 back this week so that you'll have time to revise it. The discussion forum for this week is mainly dealing with the chapter we're going to talk about, which is chapter 12, the poetry preview that's from pages 611 to 650 in our book. What you're going to do is you're going to choose 2 poems from the chapter. You're going to define 2 terms from the chapter itself that deal with those poems, and explain how you think each of the poems uses those terms. So this is your opinion, but you can show examples from the poems to back yourself up. So if I chose meter and sonnet, I would pick my 2 poems and show how they use meter and how they use sonnet. And that's pretty much it. I always like this discussion forum because I want to see what poems you pick, if people choose similar poems, if people choose similar terminologies for the poems. It's kind of fun to see what our own selections are and what we kind of draw on in terms of relation to that poem. So it's fun times, right? But let's go back to this week. So the only things due are your thesis and the discussion forum. All right. So with that in mind, the only thing I have left to talk about today is going to be chapter 12 of our poetry preview, which is on page 611. And I'm going to show you all, this is probably the last semester we're going to use this book. And I'm really sad because I love this book and I love using it. And I love the way that they open up poetry. And I think it's very fitting for this year specifically. And I'm going to tell you all why here in just a second. So in our book, poetry goes over chapters. The first part, if you go to your resources and handouts, you'll see this actually listed in week 7. You can go ahead and open it up from week 7, but this PowerPoint goes over chapters 12 through 15. We're just going to look at chapter 12 today, and then next week we're going to look over 13, 14, and 15. So chapter 12 is the voice of poetry. So in our textbook on page 611, there's this shot of Michael Jordan, like about to dunk the ball, right? If I can get the camera to show it. Yeah. And I think it's weird at first that a chapter on poetry would choose to use a basketball player as its representation, right? I think if you've watched The Last Dance that's on Netflix that deals with Michael Jordan, or if you've ever grown up in the 90s or watched NBA or anything like that, Michael Jordan was kind of at the top of his field. Or at least I'm a big Michael Jordan fan. So when I was a kid, I was like, Michael Jordan had the big puffy Chicago Bulls jacket, all about it. But our textbook relates it to poetry is language at its best. Poetry is literature at its most refined, proper state. And that's kind of like Michael Jordan with basketball. Michael Jordan is basketball at its best. Poetry is language at its best. So it makes sense that Michael Jordan's kind of the face of this chapter to start us off talking about poetry. It fits really well, and I really like that they decided to use it. And this book was published around the early 2000s, so it's coming off Michael Jordan's stint in the NBA, so it kind of makes sense why they chose him. If we did it now, you'd probably put I don't know, Stephen Curry or LeBron James or Kobe Bryant or some other player in there. But for when this textbook was made, the context makes a lot of sense. So poetry is different than a lot of literature that we ever come to terms with. And it's different for a lot of reasons. It's very emotional. I think poetry is designed to elicit an emotional response. A lot of people write poetry as therapy. I can't tell you how many times in high school I wrote horrifically amateurish poetry that will never see the light of day. But when you're a teenager, that's like a really good way to get your emotions out, and teenagers are full of emotions. So it's just a really good way to therapeutically deal with your thoughts, to get things out on paper. And the nice thing about poetry is that if you don't want it to have rules, it doesn't have to have rules. So you could just write poetry however you wanted to, and that's a way to get that emotion there. Some poetry has specific structure, whether it's lines of verse, or it's a sonnet, or it's free form or open form, and we're going to talk about that in this unit. But it's not solely linear or narrative based. It can kind of have a lot of different forms. Some of the poetry terminology that they start out with, they talk about an epic versus a lyric. When we think of epic, it's a very long poem, like a long stylized poem. So probably the example I always go with is Beowulf. We read it in my medieval lit class in high school. Beowulf, you don't think of it as a poem because in the English translation, it doesn't rhyme anymore. But if you go back and you read Beowulf in its original translation, in its original format, it does rhyme. It has a poetic structure. It's just really, really long. And that's an epic. The opposite, though, is a lyric. And lyrics are what we think of songs today. When you hear a song on the radio, that's a lyric. It's a short, just usually 3-verse poem, maybe with some extra repetitive verses throughout, but that's it. It's very common. We have extended metaphor, which is a comparison that extends throughout the poem. So when we're comparing something, that comparison just carries on throughout the entire piece of text. When we think of poems, we often think of rhyme, and that's on page 624. Rhyme is just an echo effect that's produced when a poet repeats the same sounds at the end of the final syllables. And then we have a stanza, which on page 625 is just a set of related lines, similar to a verse. So, meter, feet, and iambic feet. I love talking about this with y'all, and I found a really cool example I'm so excited to show you. Meter is the regulated, free-flowing rhythm of ordinary speech. And that sounds like a mouthful, but basically what it is that when you read poetry out loud, it's a totally different experience. So reading poetry, the way that it's structured and the way that rhyme and meter and other terms come into play, your voice starts to get like a sing-songy kind of effect. You start to build a rhythm with your voice when you read poetry, and that's intentional. The author intentionally wants there to be like a sing-songy like cadence, like a rhythm, and it kind of creates its own special thing. So, a lot of poets will design their poetry to just follow a specific beat. In a line of poetry, when there are 2-part segments, those are called feet or a foot. And the way that you stress the words in those feet can change what kind of poem it is. So iambic is when you stress the last syllable in a foot of poetry. So in our textbook, if you go to page, let me find out here. I'm going to go back here to page 626. 626, we have this lovely little set of poem here. We have Robert Frost. We have Walking Through the Woods on a Snowy Evening. And there's a verse that's on page 626. It's also carries over from 625. But basically, 626 talks about meter. And there's a little verse in the center of the page. And I'm going to read it out loud. And you're going to notice that my voice is going to change a little bit when I read it. So in the middle of that page on 626, it says, "Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow." Now, you'll notice my voice kind of like wants to get in a certain rhythm. That's Frost setting up meter. And what he does here is that he uses iambic feet in this. So each other word in the poem is stressed more than the first. So I could say, "Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow." So you naturally want to give like an extra emphasis on that second syllable. And you may be asking yourself, why would he do that? Why does that matter? So when you think of Frost, he wrote this in the late 1800s, early 1900s. You didn't travel by car then, you traveled by horse, usually if you're going a certain distance. If you couldn't make it on foot, you would take a horse usually because you didn't have a car or a vehicle. So walking through the snow on horseback, I'm going to sound like a Monty Python reference here, but your horse's hooves would go. So that rhythm, that clop, 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 if you read this poem, "To watch his woods fill up with snow," it's creating this clip, clop effect. So he designed this poem that as you're reading it in your mind, and if you read it out loud, it creates this sound effect almost that's imitating a horse going through snow, which is ingenious. It's this cool idea that an author, a poet, can craft their words to create sound effects. So cool. But he does that here. So the example I want to show you all of this in action. In the past, I've used Nelly as an example. If you know Nelly, he's a rapper from the 90s. If you ever go look up some Nelly videos, his use of meter is very repetitive. It has that da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Like you can just pick up the same beat in a lot of his songs. Like it's very, very repetitive. My friend, though, found this example, and I'm so excited to show you all because I absolutely love it. I'm a geek, by the way, and I was raised in the 90s, so you all have to excuse me. But someone very distinctly noticed that famous poet Emily Dickinson uses a very basic form of meter in a lot of her poetry. You know what song uses a very basic form of meter? What lyric does? The Pokemon theme song. So, Tegan Jones here, who's publishing for Gizmodo, actually went through some old Emily Dickinson poetry, and just look up Emily Dickinson Pokemon song, and you'll notice that the common meter, the Pokemon theme song follows a very common meter. So it's, "I want to be the very best." It's like no one ever was. Like it's just very basic, right? And then Emily Dickinson's poetry does the exact same thing. So imagine if you ever watched Pokemon as a kid, and I did as a child, singing the song, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." Like you could just read this poem in the song style of Pokemon theme song. It's ruined Emily Dickinson for me. I can tell you all that now. The same thing goes. Give it a try with Fly Buzz. "I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room." It's awful. So your non-graded homework for this week is to go find this article and then play the Pokemon theme in the background and try to say these song lyrics, and it's the Pokemon theme. I've ruined Emily Dickinson for you all, so I hope you're all happy. But that's meter. That sing-song equality is meter. And that's what our book is stressing. So I just thought that was a really fun example. Kind of nerdy. Other poetry terminology, half and slant rhymes, pairs of words that do not rhyme but sound similar. So if you ever hear a song and you're like, that doesn't rhyme, but it kind of sounds like it could, that's a half or a slant rhyme. So think of like mice and fight. Mice and fight do not rhyme traditionally, but mice and fight have that same like I sound. That's a slant rhyme. Similar, but it's not quite a rhyme. Then we have free verse versus open form. These types of poems are very similar, but they have a very key distinction. Open form poetry is just like it sounds. It's open in that it does not have to rhyme, doesn't have to have a pattern, but it's a form. It still looks like a poem, even if it doesn't rhyme or have any pattern. Free verse is like no rules. You can do whatever you want with a free verse poem. Does it have to look like a poem? No. It can be just like a paragraph of text. It may not resemble poetry. It may be like words scattered about on a page that looks very avant-garde. It's just a poem in terms of its emotionality and its purpose. But other than that, it doesn't have to have any rules. To be honest, I'm not a fan of free verse. I like my poem to look like a poem, but some people really like it. So it's apples and oranges. But how you interact with poetry is that you have to give poetry a close reading. The good thing is that most poems are short, so you can go back and reread them over and over again and try to pick them apart for certain meaning. But you need to read it closely. You need to understand the author and their intent if you can. Sometimes it's not always possible, but it's nice to get your bearings and know what you're getting into. Respond to the poem as a whole. With a book, you can respond to things like chapter by chapter, but with a poem, you need to kind of read it all in its entirety before analyzing it. Get into the spirit of the poem. Is the poem like emotional? Is it about nature? Like what's the intent? And that's going to help you kind of be able to analyze it more thoroughly. And then be ready for a personal response. Poetry often is designed to elicit emotions. Like it wants you to feel something. You can read a book and it just be for fun or just be for a comedic purpose or not tug at your heartstrings. But poetry is designed to get a reaction from you. Whether it's comedy or drama or tragedy, it's supposed to elicit something. So that's always something to keep in mind. And then finally, the last slide of this chapter is vignette versus haiku. And these are both really short poems. Haiku is just 3 lines of poetry. Each line has to have a certain number of syllables. So typically with poetry, your syllable requirements are 5, 7, 5. So the first line of poetry is 5 syllables, the second line is 7, and the third line is 5. So my example here is, class is almost done. 5. Can you hear spring calling now? 7. Wish class was over. 5. That's a haiku. Then there's vignettes. Vignettes don't follow a specific rhyme or syllable scheme. They just have to be 1 to 3 lines. And that's it. So they're very, very, very short poems. But usually the shorter the poem is, the more you have to be concentrating on exactly what words you use and what the format or purpose is. So it's pretty important that you kind of understand that when you go to writing these types of poems. But that's chapter 12. So I hope that this has given you a pretty good preview of poetry. We're going to dive much deeper into the chapters 13, 14, and 15 next week. But this is just getting you set up with poetry, getting you set up with what to expect. As always, feel free to, if you have any questions about paper 2, about the chapter, about any of the assignments, feel free to email me and let me know. But otherwise, I'm really excited to read your first papers, to get them back to you, and I'm super excited to delve into poetry. I told y'all, we're going to have fun with poetry this semester, and I'm excited. So I hope you all have a great week. Stay safe, and I'll talk to you all again soon. Bye!